see all of you here, especially given we're in the middle of final exam week where everybody is full of tension and maybe a little overextended. So thank you for coming. My name is Teresa Tobin. I'm the head librarian in the Humanities Library. And together with the MIT Press Bookstore, we sponsor this Authors at MIT series. And the purpose of the series is to celebrate the scholarship and work of MIT faculty and staff, or sometimes to celebrate publication of the MIT Press, sometimes both. Tonight we are celebrating the work of two people affiliated at MIT, the authors of Guanxi, Microsoft China and Bill Gates' plan to win the road ahead, which for me provided a really nice context to help me understand why on earth President Hu visited Gates first before he went to see our president. It was very interesting, and now I have a better understanding of the forces at work here. Our two authors who will be talking tonight, taking your questions, and will sign copies of your book after the lecture are Robert Buderi, who's at our Center for International Studies at MIT, and Greg Wong, who has a PhD from MIT from 1999 and is currently at New Scientist as an editor. So I hope you'll welcome them and enjoy this engaging talk.
Bill Gates made his first China in 1994, and it didn't exactly go very well. We had translated a very terse account from Science Daily newspaper. It was given the headline, "The Mysterious Journey to China of the World's Richest Man." His first visit to China was very short. It was March 21st, 1994, when he was 39, to sell windows. He met Jiang Zemin. Jiang talked with Gates about Chinese civilization. He said Gates should try to understand Chinese language and culture in order to be able to collaborate more.
About a year and a half later, Mr. Gates made his second trip to China. This time he brought his wife and his father and his good friend, Warren Buffett. This time he seems to be doing a little bit better. The same newspaper said, Jiang asked Gates where he would visit this time. Gates said, Western China, including Xi'an, the terracotta warriors and horses, 3 gorges. Jiang said, 3 gorges is a good idea. He then recited several traditional poems about the gorges. Jiang talked with Gates as if he was Gates' father. Jiang said, "You're doing well. If you keep working hard, you'll succeed even more."
Well, Bill Gates went back several times over the next few years. It was on each time developing actually a warmer relationship with the Chinese leader. It was on his 5th visit in early 2003 that they really hit their stride. They talked only briefly about business. Then they got down to a wide-ranging discussion that included some talk about the U.S. stock market. And we would like to show you how that went.
So, why was Microsoft worth almost $1 trillion?
Well, you have to take earnings and project them out over 30 years to get net present value, which gives you the current stock price.
Well, I guess, okay, but still, $1 trillion seems too much.
Yeah, it was too much. It's much more reasonably valued now. The whole stock market was in a bubble.
Well, stock was in a bubble. So why didn't you sell all of your Microsoft shares?
Well, I have certain responsibilities to my shareholders.
Why didn't the company sell all of its shares?
Well, we didn't have that many shares. Plus, that would be viewed as not having confidence in the company.
I guess I understand. This whole thing is not very rational.
You know, Mr. Jiang, you are a real capitalist.
Your turn.
We started this book
because we began hearing more and more about this research lab that Microsoft set up in China in 1998. It went from nothing to become the top computer science draw in all of China. Increasingly important in Microsoft's escalating battles against Nokia and wireless, Sony and entertainment, and especially Google in search. But far more than the successes of this one lab, what really lit our fire was what it said about the future of innovation. And that is that a country like China, an emerging nation, has to be viewed as more than just a nice market or a place for outsourcing and cheap manufacturing, but as a vast pool of talent that must be cultivated and harvested in order to compete today. So we dive down into the story. We think we got at issues beyond the kind of rhetoric about the Asia threat. We look at issues of education. And we really tried to get down deeper about what it takes to compete today and what it takes to do business with emerging nations, which often take a longer time horizon than American companies are used to doing business with. It means increasingly doing business on the host country's terms and finding ways for everybody to win. So what we tried to do, which we don't think any other book we know of about doing business in China does, is tell the story through the eyes of the people involved. Get down on the ground with them, report them, with them, go to parties with them, play basketball with them, sit through demos, and really give you a feeling for what it was like on the ground to build this lab. We hope that in the process of this, we've drawn out some of the lessons about doing business, not just in China, but any emerging nation, in a way that we hope is more fun and memorable than a management treatise, which we don't know how to write anyway. We had no affiliation with Microsoft. We made no deals with them. They had no right to look at what we wrote, and they didn't. We hold no stock in the company, and the few times that we took a meal from them, we always tried to reciprocate. So if the road ahead is Bill Gates's metaphor for the future, this lab in Beijing was our metaphor for the road ahead.
So the idea for the book goes back to 2004, early in 2004. Both of us were at Technology Review at the time. And like Bob said, we'd both been following some of the technologies and some of the innovations coming out of this lab in Beijing. So when Bob sent me over there to do about a week's worth of reporting, I was just really thrilled. And I came back with a really interesting story. It turned into a cover feature for the magazine. And when we got to talking about doing the book together, it was really a no-brainer for me because it combined my interest in technology and engineering, as well as a chance to touch the culture of where my family comes from. My parents come from mainland China. They settled in Boston in the late 1950s by way of Taiwan. So actually, to this day, I think the main reason that Bob wanted to work with me on this project was because he thought I could actually speak Chinese. It wasn't until we got to Beijing that he realized what an incredible mistake he had made in choosing a partner. I can tell you a little bit about the title of our book, at least. But first, I want to tell you the best question that we've got so far on our tour, which is, what is Guan 11?
It's Ocean's 11 in Chinese, we tell people. Pick it up.
And what if I haven't read Guan 9 and Guan 10? No, okay, so Guanxi is this Chinese word that means art of relationships. It's composed of two characters. The top one is Guan, which means gate or door. The bottom is Xi, which means to tie. Another interpretation is it also can mean a closed system, as we learned recently. Why is it so important? Well, today in China, it's still the case that there's really still no such thing as a purely business relationship. You have to learn to blend the business with the personal. Sometimes it's not clear where one ends and the next one and the other begins. But it's not really that mysterious. The Guanxi pretty much boils down to 4 principles that can be translated roughly as trust, favor, dependence, and adaptation, where probably the most important one is the last one, which means that these relationships have to be nurtured over time. They can't be bought, they can't be rushed. You may not think you're making progress with your host, but as long as you continue to be sincere, be honest about what you're trying to accomplish together, you're going to be okay. And really, the bottom line is that you have to have Guanxi in order to be successful in China. If you look at the history of Western companies going into China, or foreign companies, you'll see that it's not always the quality of the products that determines whether they capture a large market share. If you look at Coke just dominating over Pepsi, Volkswagen over Toyota, and more recently Motorola just really destroying Ericsson over there. It's clear that building relationships with the host country is important. Now, China has been in the news a lot lately, not always good. You have a flap over outsourcing of jobs, huge trade deficit, the U.S. losing its lead in science and technology. One of the main messages in our book is that anything construed as a China threat can really be turned around and be thought of as an opportunity. So you're all familiar with the numbers, the sheer numbers of graduates in technology and science coming out of China compared to the U.S. What if we could tap that talent stream and turn that into a productive thing for the U.S.? Now, if you look at the market numbers, I mean, China's already number one in cell phone and mobile devices, catching up very quickly to the U.S. in web users and personal computing. So the message here is actually that China is not, contrary to what you might have heard, a waking giant. China is already awake, and it's already leading in some very key areas of technology. The question is, what can we do about it to turn that to a competitive advantage?
Well, this is really a key point for us as we looked at some of these numbers. And what the point is not that China is this nice addition to the bottom line. It's that the flow of innovation in the world is changing. The way Microsoft used to do business, and other companies too, was invent something here, spiral it to Europe, and then localize it in the Chinese market. If you look at these numbers, say, in cell phones, what it tells you is that the pioneering innovations are often going to come from China, because that's where the users are. That's where things are being invented there now that are going to be spiraling over here. So to tap into this, to be part of it, and be close to it is a big challenge. And for whatever you think about Microsoft and its innovative prowess, it was very innovative in seeing China as more than just a market back in 1998 when it set up this research lab. At the time, a lot of Western companies were opening research labs overseas, especially in Japan. Microsoft itself opened up a lab in Cambridge, England in 1998. In every case, companies were opening labs near major universities in developed markets. But to set up a research lab in China where the market was not yet developed and where universities were, by all accounts, a few generations behind world-class universities like MIT, say, was a very unusual move. Microsoft got going in 1998. They looked, first thing they did was look for a director. They settled on this guy. His name's Kai-Fu Lee. He's been in the news a lot lately. He was born in Taiwan. He moved to the U.S. when he was 11 to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. He went to Columbia and then got his PhD at Carnegie Mellon, where he pioneered in speech recognition. Was hired by Apple, then Silicon Graphics, which is where Microsoft got on to him. And he was, for Microsoft, a perfect choice because he spoke Mandarin and understood a lot about Chinese culture. He was completely schooled in research and U.S. R&D management. And maybe most important of all, he burned with this passion to go to China and help lift it up. His father had been an administrator in the nationalist government that was overthrown by Mao in 1949, and he had to flee to Taiwan for his life, leaving behind his wife and 5 children. And it took Kai-Fu Lee's mother a whole year to get out with all the children, and as a result, they were one of the few families from the government that was reunited in whole. Kai-Fu Lee was born after that. He was the 7th child. And throughout this experience, what motivated him more than anything was getting to China and help lift it up into part of this kind of world of innovation and R&D that he'd been part of in the U.S. So one of the first things he did was settle this raging argument at Microsoft where to put the lab, Beijing or Shanghai. Beijing was the center of government, close to some universities. Shanghai was the center of commerce and entrepreneurialism and very business savvy. So Kai-Fu Lee settled it in a very appropriate way. He called his mom, who was in Taiwan. And she had lived actually in both cities. And he said, "Mom, I'm going to go to work for Microsoft. I'm thinking of setting up a lab, Beijing or Shanghai." She said, Beijing. It's so cold there in the winter, so hot in the summer. All those serious government people, Shanghai. Ah, the weather is beautiful. The food is fantastic. If you move to Shanghai, I'm going to move in with you. Kai-Fu Lee told his wife, and she said, we're definitely going to Beijing.
Now, Kai-Fu Lee insists that's a joke, and that the real reason was that when he talked to students in Beijing and young researchers, they were more interested in doing top research, whereas in Shanghai, he thought they were more interested in making money. And really, the main point of the lab in the beginning was to get on the ground and do great research. So this is where the Microsoft lab is located, this building in northwest Beijing. It's the high-tech district called Haidian. And this place has just exploded in the last 5-10 years. There's now a Walmart across the street here, just tens of thousands of people going through there every day. McDonald's down the street, Starbucks in the Forbidden City. Now, when Kai-Fu Lee hit the ground in 1998, he had some critical challenges to how do you actually set up this lab to do research in China. Nobody had really done it in computer science that well at that time. It's probably these challenges were not unique so much to Microsoft, but they were kind of unique to China. The first thing is something we emphasize a lot in the book, which is building these relationships, building the Guanxi with Chinese officials and academics at all levels. The second one was to recruit. He could not lower the bar in terms of the quality of talent he brought in. He had to get the absolute cream of the crop. And together with that, when you're sort of what we call insourcing a lot of this local talent from Chinese universities, you had to have top senior level staff who could actually spend time one-on-one to mentor them, or at least delegate to more of the senior researchers to really spend time mentoring these kids. I'm just going to go really briefly through this. Bob and I had a chance to go along on some of these outreach programs that the Microsoft lab is doing. And this one is, this shot is from an auditorium in Tsinghua University in Beijing. And what Kai-Fu Lee set up was within a year, there was this traveling roadshow of computer science speakers, really distinguished speakers, Turing Award winners, Draper Prize winners, even Nobel laureates. And they would go to places in China that had never seen Microsoft before, kind of getting the name brand out there, but also showing that they were going to collaborate with local officials, local universities to train students. In terms of recruiting the cream of the crop, one of the first guys they got in the lab was this guy the kid in the blue jacket. His name is Jin Li. He was already a celebrity in China, largely thanks to this picture. So it's a 1984 shot from a Shanghai science fair. And Jin Li, you can see, is giving a computer demonstration to none other than the Chinese reform leader, Deng Xiaoping. This is famous because it was part of a massive campaign to promote Chinese computer science education. And the story is that Deng Xiaoping had a slogan. And his slogan was, Chinese computer science education should begin with children, and this is the future of China. And he put his hand on Jin Li's head as he said this. So tens of millions of people, in fact, to this day, know Jin Li by the nickname, Deng touched my head. But between us, in trying to find a picture that actually showed Deng touching his head, we could not find it. So it's sort of an apocryphal story, and we don't have any photo evidence. And this picture is even known as Deng touched my head, even though he's not touching. It's kind of strange. So together with the young talent, they had to recruit senior guys. So these guys don't even look that senior, but they're incredibly accomplished. They're three of the main characters in our book, and they're highly tied into the workings of the lab. They're the core leadership under Kai-Fu Lee and succeeded him after he left. The guy on the left, I'll just tell you a little bit about them all. The guy on the left is Yaqin Zhang. He was the youngest college student in all of China at the age of 12. He became this engineering multimedia whiz. In fact, came to the US to do his grad work and turned down MIT for George Washington. Not sure about that move, but it seemed to work out well. He made his name at Sarnoff, became the youngest IEEE fellow in the history of that organization, that US organization, at the age of 30, which is really incredible. Now he heads up he's vice chair of Microsoft China, and he's in charge of all of Microsoft R&D in China, about 1,000 people and growing fast. The guy in the middle is named as Hongzhang Zhang, no relation to Yaqin. An interesting story, his background, he comes from a rural part of China. He calls it the Kansas of China. And he and his brother were two of only 6 people from his entire county who made it into college. This was right after the Cultural Revolution, ending in the mid-'70s, where their education was pretty much shut down within the country. So it was very difficult to get in, very difficult entrance exams. And he now heads up the development lab, which is the development arm of the Beijing Research Lab called the Advanced Technology Center. And his expertise is in image retrieval and information retrieval, the backbone of web search. The guy on the right is Harry Shun. He's the current director of the Beijing lab. He's a graphics expert. He grew up in China as well and went to college by the age of 13. So these guys are all kind of baby geniuses. He did his PhD at Carnegie Mellon. In fact, was turned down by MIT for grad work. A fact that he still sort of harbors a chip on his shoulder to this day, because he talked to him and he motivates the researchers under him by saying, "Do you think you can do better than those MIT guys, in graphics and so forth?" And if not, they have to stay till they don't sleep at night. So, but he was recently promoted as a distinguished engineer at Microsoft. There's only a few dozen of those, so he's a pretty well-respected guy.
Well, these guys were like magnets for Microsoft. When Microsoft first arrived in China, got a very lukewarm reception. The senior vice president of research came to give a talk at Tsinghua University, the main science university in China. Nobody showed up to introduce him, to host him, unheard of in China. So Microsoft actually had to send around a Microsoft employee to pretend to be from Tsinghua University. welcome to Tsinghua University. That all changed when these guys hit the ground. The lab began receiving thousands of resumes, just pouring into the lab the cream of the crop of Chinese computer science. And it was tremendously successful almost within the first 6 months of pulling these into the lab. But right away, it hit into a kind of roadblock that even though all these guys were from China or steeped in Chinese culture, they hadn't quite appreciated. And that was the vast kind of communications and culture gap between a Western R&D system and Chinese education system. So these were things like the managers were used to being very direct. The students, the new recruits, were trying to read between the lines of what that meant. The managers expected these PhDs to have a lot of initiative and creativity and hit the ground running. They were very used to following specific instructions and would not even dream sometimes of taking off on their own course. So this actually sparked a big cultural clash. We tried to find a photo that really got to the heart of this, and the best we could find was Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft, playing basketball last summer with some of the research lab guys from Beijing. And you see the kind of blank stares as he tries to explain some basketball moves. We thought that was a great photo until we actually showed it at Microsoft, and they said everybody looks at Ballmer that way. But this was a big crisis in the lab. It sparked a whole new look at how they did things. They had to change their hiring practices. They had to reset all the targets and make them much more specific and spend a lot more time with the new recruits, laying out what was expected of them in order to make them successful. And they had to have a longer time horizon for when they would begin to contribute. We spent a lot of time on that in the book. We're just going to jump here and show you what they were successful, though, in doing was building up 5 core areas of expertise for Microsoft. User interfaces was Kai-Fu Lee's original area, speech recognition and things like that. Multimedia, graphics, wireless, and most recently, search. As a matter of fact, Microsoft had canceled its search research back in 2000 or so, and it was kept alive by Hongjiang Zhang, the guy in the middle of that photo, as a bootleg project. And when Microsoft rediscovered the importance of search in 2003, they were able to ramp up very quickly in this lab, and it has become probably the epicenter of Microsoft's new technology development in search as it tries to catch up so desperately with Google. So it was only supposed to be 100 researchers, but it's already 200 researchers. They've put out 1,000 papers, hundreds of patents. But just to give you an idea, SIGGRAPH is the world's leading graphics society. Well, last year, 9 out of 94 papers in the world came from this lab in Beijing. And SIG-IR, which is information retrieval, the backbone of search, you can see about 14% of all the papers in the world came out of this one lab. The products, the technologies are starting to find their way into products in almost every aspect of Microsoft's business. And like I said, it's really coming to the fore, especially in search, where they've now created a whole search technology center inside the lab that's about 50 people strong now and be about 100 strong by the end of the year.
If there's a main message in the book, though, it's that despite all your successes, despite all your great academic work and technologies and products, in China especially, you can't forget about the ongoing process of building relationships. So in one of our chapters, we try to take you behind the scenes in a closed-door meeting between Microsoft officials and Chinese government officials, tell you a little bit about how they interact and the kinds of deals that they're talking about. The scene takes place about 40 miles northwest of Beijing, along a stretch of the Great Wall of China that's called the Wild Wall, because it's unrestored. You can see the vegetation and trees growing up through it. It's very difficult to hike on there. It gets very slippery in the rain. This section of the wall dates back to the 14th century. At the foot of this hill, there's a ultra-modern architectural exhibit that's called the Commune by the Great Wall. If you ever have a chance to visit it, I would recommend it. It doubles as a high-end resort, and this is one of the 11 kind of strangely designed villas that make up that resort. You can sort of see the ruins of the Great Wall snaking along the top of the ridge there. Now, so in May of 2005, we were privy to this meeting between Microsoft and the Ministry of Education. It was historic in that it was the first time a foreign company had sat down with members of every major division from that ministry. And what they were talking about, what they were trying to lay out was a plan that they called the Great Wall Plan, a collaboration between Microsoft and China to train students and researchers to develop talent, in essence, to help China develop the next generation or a new generation of software developers. And in exchange for that, Microsoft is getting a lot of talent to work on its own proprietary projects. Another part of the deal was that Microsoft would support these software colleges, which are computer science departments throughout China that are focused on development and not on the theory. But now the most interesting things that came out of this meeting were watching the social customs and how these two groups interact and the sort of patience that went into this whole process. So in the beginning, the two groups don't know each other very well. The senior people take a long time just to sort of decide even where to sit in the room. So in the book, there's a couple stories where just where you sit makes a difference in the impression you're making with the host. So the senior people will typically sit in the middle of the room or at the middle of the table, and their junior staff will sit along the sides, and they'll sort of wait to be introduced one by one with a little story. Then after a couple hours of meeting, they start to get a little more comfortable, and maybe it gets time for dinner. So they'll have a big buffet with all kinds of Chinese food and drink and liquor. And so one of the funny things that we saw were the customs of Chinese toasting, which I had not understood before. And so some of the
That's because you don't speak Chinese.
The rules are that you don't toast in the beginning, or you don't toast the whole group at once. You always toast one-to-one. You toast throughout the meal, even if your glass is empty. And to show respect for the person you're toasting, you should keep your glass lower than theirs. So sometimes it happens that the two guys spill their drinks because they crash into the table. I'm trying to bring it too low. So in this chapter, we just kind of pull out that there was no deal signed at the end of this meeting, but the relationship was sort of started and would be developed over the next few months.
And in fact, they did make a tremendous deal later in the fall, last fall. Well, everything looked great for Microsoft at this time, last May. Things had been going extremely well, almost no competition in China for recruiting the best of the best. As we rode around, we stayed with the lab for about a year, beginning in November 2004, going through November of 2005. As we rode around with them and people started forgetting we were there, we had a great time as we learned more and more about this. We rode one time with the senior vice president of research on a bus out to Beijing airport. We were in the back, and he started talking about how Microsoft's going to win a Nobel Prize when it crushes Nokia. And he's like, because the Swedes hate the Finns, when we crush Nokia, we're going to get a Nobel Prize. So we're following all this. Everything is looking great. But unbeknownst to everyone at Microsoft, in May in 2005, almost as that meeting is taking place, Kai-Fu Lee, the founder of the lab, who'd been promoted back to Redmond as a vice president, had emailed this guy, Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, saying, I hear you're interested in going to China. I can help. What happened was announced a couple months later, last July. Kai-Fu Lee announced that he was going to go to Google and do for Larry and Sergey what he'd done for Bill, and that is open an R&D lab in China, in Beijing, to help Google not just get to the market, but help it get to the talent in China. He is there now. There was a vicious lawsuit. Kai-Fu Lee emailed me right after the story broke saying, I'm very sorry to mess up your book. I said, gee, Kai-Fu, that's really horrible. So all these great revelations came out in the court documents. We captured them in this bitter struggle, but they did settle late last year. Kai-Fu Lee is in China now, in Beijing, following the exact same steps in building the lab. He actually put the Google lab on the edge of Tsinghua University campus, in between it and the Microsoft lab. And they are hitting the ground running. They are already rivaling Microsoft in the recruitment of talent. Many people are choosing to go with Google instead of Microsoft. The deal that brought Kai-Fu Lee there in the first place was a $10 million package, unprecedented for an R&D manager. So as we look at this, we think it's great news. We think this is just what happens in the world as competition simmers up. Microsoft had a nice run, but it's actually going to get better now that it has competition. Google's going to get better, and especially China is going to get better, because what China wants more than anything now is not capital or low-cost manufacturing, but the access to the tools of knowledge creation. And if you as a Western company can come in and provide training, collaborations with universities and industry, and actually maybe even sow the seeds of your own competition by training this new generation, you are going to succeed very well in China. So the story's not over. As was mentioned at the beginning, just a few weeks ago, President Hu came to China, and you really began to see the payoff for this long 12 to 14-year investment that Microsoft had made. His first stop was in Seattle, where he had dinner with Bill Gates. On the heels of this announcement, actually preceding it, it was announced that Lenovo, the largest PC maker in China, was now pre-installing legal copies of Windows on every PC it sold in China. 3 other Chinese computer manufacturers made the same deal. It's expected to be about $1.5 billion in revenue for Microsoft a year. We think this is the payoff of a lot of years of Guanxi, not just from the research lab, but I will say that whenever Bill Gates meets the Chinese leader now, the head of the research lab goes with him, and in fact flew over to give President Hu a technology demonstration. He gave a demonstration actually of an equation recognizer. The Chinese leadership is almost all engineers, so they actually began to scrawl out the quadratic equation, and it was recognized. So we couldn't help wondering, could you imagine somebody doing that for President Bush? So you will also notice that Bill Gates has learned a little bit about Chinese toasting. His glass is lower than President Hu's. So anyway, that's where we're going to end today. It's a story we think of competition but renewal, and we are very pleased to see it happening around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'd like to take your questions now. Sure, and back there, sir. Yep.
Yeah, that's a great story. I've been to China quite a few times. I remember early days of Microsoft in China when they didn't quite get it right, when they were developing the Chinese language software, and they didn't actually realize that the characters used in Taiwan and the ones used in the mainland were different, and they displayed the Taiwan characters in the mainland, which was a bit of a gap. But they learned very fast, as you can see, and I can testify that the Chinese writing software on Microsoft Windows is very good. Rivals the stuff that is made in Taiwan and other places. And so this is very encouraging. The other question is almost all of those pieces of advice you gave would apply exactly, and did apply, and were given exactly to American corporations going to Japan in the 60s through the 80s. Almost exactly the same kind of advice, and yet the U.S.-Japan relationship has turned out very different. There's much less FDI, much less research labs in Japan than in China. What do you think is the difference?
Well, I can speak to the research lab part of it especially, because that's what I've studied the most. One of the things, there are many more Western R&D organizations in Japan still than in China. But in almost every case, there's nothing even close to this size. They're very small. They often don't have the critical mass to kind of own a technology area for the company, and several of them have been marginalized that I've looked at as a result. Microsoft made that a kind of imperative from the beginning that it was going to build up a center of expertise, especially in user interfaces and multimedia, from the beginning in the China lab. And as you can see, it stopped from being marginalized. It put much more resource into it. So that's one difference we can speak to.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that I think the size and scale of the country, that's an obvious difference. So that might be an advantage in that. Just the sheer size of the talent pool in the market in China.
The nature of the university system in China and Japan are very different too. They're radically trying to change the universities in China to a more American model, because the Japanese have a more established European Germanic style that's very hard to reform.
Yeah. That is true. We do talk a lot with university professors in China, and one of the things that China opened up economically about 25, 30 years ago, there is a movement, and there are actually pilot programs all over China to open up the curricula in the same way to make it more westernized, and there are probably, I don't know, a dozen or 20 different schools that have been designated pilots to try this, get away from the test. So one of the things we really thought was interesting, because over here we're trying to do more testing. Over there they're trying to get away from testing.
Bob, Greg, I think you're definitely ready for prime time. I enjoyed the presentation tremendously. I was curious about the young cream of the crop coming in and being very resident. Are there now stories that they're turning into cowboys? Are they getting it? That challenging their superiors, coming up with the hot new ideas and flying? How's the transition occurring?
I'd say there are a couple stars that we kind of point out in the book. One guy was completely China educated and came in as a junior researcher in a multimedia group, and he's actually risen now to become a key leader in Microsoft's web advertising platform and search. So, and we have a couple other examples, but I guess I would say it is changing. But those are a few cases. It's a little bit hard to say. We're kind of the level of more of an average or statistical look at where the kids end up and what they end up doing. But a lot of them end up leaving Microsoft and starting their own company. So there is a sense of entrepreneurship really sprouting there.
That's one of the key things Microsoft thinks gives it an advantage over Google in China, is that it's already invested years in some of these young talent, whereas Kai-Fu Lee is just starting out. It's going to take a couple years for them to really start to make their mark in China. So I think they really feel it's starting to pay off now, and a big percentage or a significant percentage are getting it.
This relates to your question about knowledge management and search particularly. What percentage of all pages out there are in Chinese versus English?
I don't know the exact numbers right now. I don't know if anyone here knows. It's
Chinese to English.
I think it's. I don't actually know, but I know it's. I've seen projections that within 5 to 10 years there will be more Chinese sites than English, and that's certainly not.
Back in '99. You guys know.
It must be right.
I don't know.
Business Week. But yeah, that's. I mean, because content management and knowledge management and search, you got to figure out what kind of characters you're searching for. Yeah. And so that's why I wonder why Google Labs, and you guys might not have explored maybe a little bit of that. Well, how when we search, what character sets are we using? What knowledge underlying framework are we using?
I would say multilingual search is the huge battle right now, in the 21st century.
We promised we would start a reception and stuff at 6:30, so let's just take one more question. We'd be glad to answer more questions as we sign all those books you buy. Bob?
Yeah, you have Bill Gates' plan in your title. How much does the book actually get into his vision for this whole endeavor? And did you have a chance to talk to Bill Gates about the book? Did you interview or something like that?
Yeah, we did. We did interview him briefly, probably 20 or 30 minutes about China and the R&D lab. And then again, we got to ask him a question in Japan last summer when they were opening an arm of the Beijing lab in Japan, as a matter of fact. And what we get into really, what we're talking about when we say the plan to win the road ahead, we're talking about the plan to view China as more than just a market, to the plan to tap into talent and to form a wellspring for the creation of new technology and ideas from a group of people who aren't going to come to Redmond or maybe even the United States. And that's what we're talking about. And at the end of a year, just last year, Microsoft opened its first research lab in India, and we foreshadowed that a little bit as well through Microsoft's eyes and a little bit of Gates's. But we didn't spend a lot of time with Bill. We were asked to sign a book for him, though, recently, so we'll see. All right, well, we thank you very much.
Thank you.